New Social Thought Questions of Theory and Critique by Kosmas Psychopedis. Does a new theory for the social sciences exist? What, in any case, does exist is a demand for such a theory, and it will be necessary to investigate the reasons why many parties urgently raise it. One reason is the explanatory failure of the structuralist theories of social action, but also of the theories of social cohesion and continuity. It has become apparent that the structures those theories refer to did not explain anything. They merely concealed the nature of societies as a place where power, injustice, and exploitation is perpetuated. The new theory that critically countered structuralism adopted uncertainty, deconstruction, etc. as forms of emancipation from the omnipotence and the binding nature of structures, and was consequently led to relativism and the undermining of its own discourse's coherence. The theory's crisis, when placed between structuralism and relativism, compels us to reflect on the subject matter of the social sciences. Concepts such as dialectics and materialism have been held in contempt by the new epistemologist. Structuralists or relativists come to the fore once more in need to be reappraised. The theory of value that was discussed throughout the 20th century as a theory of the economy, value labor, comes back as a theory of the human values attached by the competitive forces of social relations. The concept of uncertainty returns today on a new basis. It indicates that all structural systems constituted on the basis of coercive and exploitative relations are unstable. Their tendency and their structural operation have not yet been definitely defined. They are reversible. The theory of value, placed today in the center of the new critical theory, allows the critical re-examination of the questions of explaining social phenomena and translating between different discourses, in quotes, within the social sciences. It leads to the question of an exposition of the concepts of social sciences that will not conceal, but clarify and evaluate the conditions of social life, the human value those conditions cancel or promote, and the rules that regulate social life and communication. 1. The claim for a new theoretical thinking that could critically counter the new state of humanity is presented as both utopian and necessary. Today, it is necessary to reflect on the changes taking place in thought itself in the context of a changing world. The structure of the world of capitalist enterprises and markets is changing. The economy, technology, and communication are changing, and these developments are described with terms such as globalization, flexibility, relativization of normative frameworks, new constitutions, and so on. Themes such as the dissolution of structures and individualism become a focal point in contemporary debates. Related epistemological frameworks refer to deconstruction, deregulation, the lifting of normativities, and restoring equilibria through coercive negations. Theory considers the selection of one kind of normative framework, rights, and its juxtaposition to others as a legitimate move without, though, accounting for the criteria of its choice. It releases itself from the responsibility to detect which values are destroyed when some others are promoted and imposed. All these theoretical moves display a new thinking, reflecting a new world. Such thinking is allergic to the idea that theorems expressing responsibility and solidarity or critical questioning the natural and given character of individualism are introduced in epistemology. Those speaking of critical epistemologies that question the new thinking will probably be characterized as utopian, metaphysical, and dogmatic. However, it is not possible to do away with the question of the elements of a critical thought that would not remain apologetic and that would not attempt to whitewash the existing relations of globalization, alienation, and individualism, but would attempt to conceive these transcendence. It may be argued that such reflection on the questioning transcendence seems to constitute a condition for referring to present historical and social relations and attempting their analysis. Okay, so social theory is trapped between structuralism, which treats structures as determining everything. It has become apparent that the structures those theories refer to did not explain anything. They merely concealed the nature of societies as a place where power, injustice, and exploitation is perpetuated. And deconstruction, which dissolves all foundations. The new theory that critically countered structuralism adopted uncertainty, deconstruction, etc. as forms of emancipation from the omnipotence and the binding nature of structures, and was consequently led to relativism and the undermining of its own discourse coherence. Post-structuralism freed from the rigid structuralism, but lost the ability to make coherent normative judgments as a result. Neither can actually explain society adequately, and so the need for a new social theory will appear utopian because critical theory has been marginalized. Yet it is necessary because existing theories merely justify the world as it is. The purpose of theory is not merely description, but understanding the possibilities for transcending existing relations. 2. The deadlocks of the contemporary theoretical thinking, and of the attempts to criticize it, arise from the crisis of values that established the classical theory of society and politics. The antinomies of contemporary theoretical thinking can be seen as a result of the crisis of theory during the 19th and 20th centuries. It is actually the crisis of both bourgeois thought and its critique, which resulted from the inability to realize the society of the free and equal. That theory was striving for, in the context of theory, this crisis was imprinted as a crisis of values, of the Enlightenment values that juxtaposed freedom and equality with a reality structured in an oppressive and dominating way, but also of the values of the dialectic theory in Marxism, solidarity, socialism, that opposed a historical reality structured on selfishness and exploitation. The crisis of values appears in the context of theory as the inability to project and implement them in reality due to the lack of schemes of implementation that would impose them without negating them. Bourgeois political thought interpreted the inability to implement such values in historical relations as a result of the compulsory character that the process of such implementations would take. For example, the imposition of a liberal system through political violence, Rousseau's force et être libre, according to the reasoning, a value that is imposed becomes immediately disdained, thus both the Enlightened and socialism be denounced for the disgusting claims for power they contain. In reality, though, the process of implementing a value is made up by steps leading to the lifting of its abstract character. During this process, it becomes clear which relation between social classes and groups is expressed by the promise and the attempt to impose each value. It also becomes evident who benefits from the separation of the value on one hand and its compulsory implementation on the other. Every actor faces the dilemma of sacrificing his privileged positions, poverty, money, influence, if he insists on remaining a member of a society of free and equals that takes this promise seriously. The implementation of the value implies the dissolution of alliances, conflict, and reproduction of cynicism on the one hand, and moralistic protest on the other. However, it also implies the detection of the materialistic elements of social relations, the critique and the resistance to fetishized relations, an element that was not properly revealed by the Enlightenment and socialist theories of the 19th and 20th centuries. From both the mid-19th century, Enlightenment and dialectic projects were replaced by historicist ones, each of which claimed its own normative absoluteness, individuality, thus rendering themselves normatively indifferent. These relativistic epistemologies are seen as the expression of the defeat of the 19th century bourgeois revolutions. However, they actually constituted a victory of bourgeois spirit at the level of epistemology in spite of its political defeat. They consolidated a responsibility as the exclusive right of any future epistemology. Furthermore, they allowed the transition from historic totalities, the knowledge of a civilization, to positivism, the knowledge of neutral facts. During such moves, what is displayed is the ability to construct social facts as distinct and positive orders to be collected by social scientists. However, this construction was identical to the repression of the social plans of life, of the hopes and demands for an autonomous arrangement of social relations, the relations that were cancelled so that the facts would acquire their distinct existence and particular form. Even thought, though, concealed this repression of the normative context, which was destroyed by order to construct positive and calculable facts, was a key attitude of the previous century's dominant epistemology, and it also represents a constituting element of the contemporary crises of epistemological thought. 3. The crisis of contemporary social theory reflects the failure of previous attempts to establish theory on an individualistic and relativistic basis. Positivism did not simply develop from historicism. It also originated from the rival direction to historicism, that is, the formalistic critique towards historicism we find in Max Weber. The formalistic epistemology invented a machine for producing facts, starting with the individual rational actor who chooses appropriate means for realization of his aims. Any discussion on the historical social relations determining the aims and means of action, but also any criteria that would allow this practical evaluation of these aims, becomes banished from the area of epistemology. The Weberian axiological neutrality had a double aim. On the one hand, to distance itself from the traditional values adopted even by historicism, for example, the pre-bourgeois values of Kaiserreich. On the other hand, to distance itself from the new bindingness the socialists were advocating when claiming the epistemology should be grounded on some ideas regarding the material rationality of social systems. Methodological individualism, however, never managed to dispense with the spectrum of society altogether. It never managed to dispense with the historical relations that constitute presuppositions of individual actions and reproduce themselves in it without individual actors being aware of them. Returning to grand categories and a concept of the whole that becomes actualized behind individual actions seemed inevitable. Especially during the 20th century, it was not possible to thematize wars and crises without the use of concepts such as totalities, systems, macro aggregates. However, at the same time, social sciences should disengage itself from critical ideas like justice, social equality, and exploitation that crop up very easily in the context of macro analysis. The presence of society behind individual action can be seen in the work of Karl Menger, the most significant representative of methodological individualism, in his theory of the unintended consequences of individual action. Two main responses prevailed in dealing with the question of how such consequences should be approached. The first one can be traced back to Menger and Hayek, and according to the society behind individual constitutes a spontaneous order that is not rationally approachable. The second one originates from Weber's theory of ideal types and leads up to the functionalism we find in Parsons. Despite its individualistic methodological credo, the work of Weber displays a version of macroanalysis that appears as a sequence of correspondence between types. The rational bureaucratic action corresponds to the rational law, which is in its turn corresponds to the activity of the capitalist enterprise, which corresponds eventually to the rational orientation to the actions of individual actors. The framework of correspondence imprints the historical relations of the modern capitalist society without referring to them directly. Theory considered as binding the types constructed with axiological neutrality, not relations themselves. However, according to this construction, the critique of social relations becomes impossible. The only possible critique remaining refers to the internal coherence of the types and the extent to which empirical material fits them. The idea of the corresponding social macrotypes is a forerunner of the post-Weberian functional analysis we find in Parsons. The corresponding types, the political, economic, social, and so on, are here replaced by individual subsystems. The function of each is a presupposition for the function of the others. At the core of systematic analysis, we do not encounter the individual anymore, but society solving its own problems. However, even here, we can detect an element that characterized the Weberian rationale of correspondence and was later utilized by structuralism. The context of action is analyzed in terms of a normatively neutral science. It is not possible to evaluate in a binding way either the aims of actors or the aims of science. So methodological individualism never managed to dispense with the spectrum of society altogether, despite starting the project with rational individuals, because it ended up continually smuggling society back in, as wars, crises, and large-scale institutions are unable to be explained in any meaningful way through isolated individuals and actions, causing the world to be obfuscated by these views. Weber's supposedly neutral analysis creates a correspondence between institutions without explaining their historical relations. Due to the inability of analysis of individuals to explain the world, it becomes inevitable to defer to macro conceptions. And as a result of this, a faux axiological neutrality is posited, where ideal types are studied instead of actual social relations. Consequently, the critique of social relations becomes impossible from such a view. 4. The failure to establish a theory of social sciences for the modern era takes the form of structuralist epistemology and theory of knowledge. One of the most characteristic aspects of the social sciences crisis during the 20th century was manifested within structuralist methodologies. What is peculiar in these methodologies is the repression of the process through which the conditions of social life are constituted, but also of the human values affirmed and revoked through those conditions. Processes are replaced with arbitrary collections of data and behaviors forming whole on the basis of models taken from mathematics and linguistics. Such collections of religious, economic, etc. practices are appropriate for drawing parallels and establishing the extent to which they correspond to each other. Moves that may be necessary during the process of research appear now as the core of the epistemological constitution of the subject matter. In this way, however, what is achieved is the opposite of what any critical methodology promises and claims. In other words, the possibility of showing that the structuring process coincides with the processes of exploitation, coercion, and the negation of emancipation is precluded from the outset. Structuralism, to a great extent, was based on the misunderstanding that any form of holistic anti-individualism at the level of methodology coincides with critical science. An example of such misunderstanding is Bourdieu's theory. Bourdieu seems to believe that it is possible to formulate a sociological metascience which incorporates theoretical assumptions of various epistemological origins, summing up the major principles conditioning such knowledge. He refers, for example, to Marx, Durkheim, Weber, and adopts concepts such as the division of labor and class as central macro-theoretical categories. The demand of reducing individual standpoints to structural characteristics, with the mediation of habitus and so on, leads him to a scientific model whose structure is taken from the natural sciences. In the context of this model, any element of evaluation, critique, and action is banished from his construction, labeled as subjectivist. Thus, the attempt to identify individualism with positivism and criticize it as such ends up with the glorification of positivism, now embedded in the very structural totality. Bourdieu thinks that it is, after all, possible to represent individual phenomena as realizations of a secret transformations of structures. The more successful this attempt is, the more it ensures that in reality, the positivistic and fetishized form will spread to all strata of social life. A logical consequence of structural thought is the rationale of articulation that has developed in theories of Fordism, post-Fordism, and the regulation approach. On this, see the volume edited by Bonefeld and Holloway, 1991. Oh, that's their book on, I don't know how to say the year, it's their book on the state debate. That's when the year that came out. A significant aspect of theory's crisis, not sufficiently explored, refers to the coupling of the theory of knowledge with scientism in the context of structuralism. As far as this point is concerned, Althusser's approach to the process of knowledge constitutes a characteristic case. Knowledge constitutes A, the processing of raw material, experience ideological constructions, with the use of B, theoretical tools, scientific abstraction, so as to C, produce the concrete outcomes of knowledge. This work model, which goes back to Spinoza's theory of knowledge, is an empiricist and scientistic one. Opposite to thought lies an essential and definable object, an obscure object materiality, which supposedly becomes gradually known to the researcher. It is not recognized that this unknown thing is itself preeminently known, that is, it indeed's the case of cause of knowledge. This is what constitutes social materiality, including the contemporary alienating and dividing capitalist forms of life, questioning and rejected by people. The process of knowledge coincides with the pointing as the reason for the questioning. It does not invent ex nihilo social relations. The real, Hegel's concrete, Spinoza's third form of knowledge, not only exists before research, but also defines, as far as the form is concerned, its direction and result. The concrete is not only a result, but also a condition of the scientific inquiry mediating it. The antinomic and exploitative relation, a social communication and shared reference, the globalization of aggressive demands on each other's conditions of life. There is indeed a starting point. The starting point is in a historical state of crisis that forms the direction of scientific questions. It comprises the knowledge, consciousness of antinomic and exploitative relations of social communication and shared research reference of the globalization of aggressive claims on each other's conditions of life. Consequently, the naive surprise of social scientists for every new thing they encounter is a hypocritical repulsion of the knowledge of these relations. Structuralism, and I would say post-structuralism and actor network theory, replicate a more sophisticated positivism that fails to be subversive. Processes are replaced with arbitrary collections of data and behaviors, forming wholes on the basis of models taken from mathematics and linguistics. Structuralism replaces living social pressures with abstract models, just like Weber does, and so the possibility of showing that the structuring processes coincide with processes of exploitation, coercion, and the negation of emancipation is precluded from the outset. The attempt to identify the individualism with the positivistic conception of society ends up with glorification of this positivism, as it is now embedded in the very structural totality. The process of knowledge coincides with the pointing as the reasons for questioning. In other words, knowledge begins from lived contradictions and not from scientific machinery processing neutral data. 5. The contemporary theory in crisis, reacted to the deadlocks of structuralism by accepting the indeterminacy of structures. However, it did not comprehend the reasons reproducing social relations of indeterminacy. One reaction to the deadlock of the structural determination of the real was the introduction of indeterminacy as a natural state of the social sciences epistemology. Blinding logics were replaced by the conception of history grasped as a framework of contingencies where certain structures stabilize themselves momentarily. They were also replaced by conception of the real conceived as the product of coincidental combination of factors and at the point where the contingent and incidental are activated. This school of thought, which can be characterized as the new irresponsibility, conceived the necessary transition from structuralism to indeterminacy as a constituting element of social relations. However, it did not pursue the inversion of this move, which is equally inscribed in the social, that is, showing that indetermination and instability result from the way social relations are constructed as unjust, exploitive, and subject to domination. Many contemporary epistemological trends, without abandoning the context of axiological neutrality and scientism, have made significant attempts to deal with the question of indetermination and uncertainty from a methodological point of view. One mode of argumentation, Luhmann, deals with the question of indeterminacy as one of reducing the complexity of reality by introspection to the relevant criteria with which the real values is approximated. This problem leads to these theories to a question where they have not dealt with sufficiently. This question refers to the construction of a coherent discourse on values, and the way these problems of the conditions of action is involved in the discourse. A second way of argumentation, Giddens' approach, the question of indeterminacy, with reference to an enlightened educational process adjusting the action in the context of uncontrolled and uncertain circumstances. The action under the uncertain conditions is analyzed in the context of the theory of dual structure/structuration, according to which the structured properties of social systems are simultaneously meant and outcomes of social actions. That is, here the conditions of action are connected equally to the issue of the actor's aim and that of the social reproduction. However, it becomes evident that this connection takes place in the context of a theory referring primarily to the stances of individual actors and at the expense of the macro-theoretical approach of the reproduction of the social conditions of life. This becomes evident when we examine Giddens' conception on the nature of structures. This is defined as something that does not exist in time and space, because time and space are properties characterizing the interaction of living beings only. Giddens transfers Saussure's problematic on linguistic structures to that of social structures, and argues that structures do not describe objective relations of interaction. They constitute genetic rules, or codes, and means of action activated in every individual action. Following Wittgenstein, Giddens approaches rules as part of practical consciousness, occasionally allowing us to go further. However, they cannot be interpreted on the basis of their integration in the meaning they acquire in a social context, relativism. In the place of a macro-theoretical context of reference, an area of antagonism and conflict among actors is introduced. This refers to the interpretation and the transformation of rules. Here, actors use the means of power available to them with the aim of imposing their own interpretation of rules. Thus, in a quite typical manner, methodological agnosticism is supplemented by a theory of antagonism, agonistic. The philosophical elements Giddens has borrowed from Weberian tradition are obvious. For example, the state only exists in the consciousness of actors as something towards which they orientate their actions. In this way, however, it becomes evident that this line of argument fails to achieve its professed aim. Not to be simply a theory of the individual resort to the conditions reproducing the means of action, but also a theory of the reproduction of these conditions. Indeed, it fails because the conditions are merely described from the standpoint of the individual approach to them, while the rest is seen as an unknown condition and unpredictable consequences. As a result, theorizing the pre-existing conditions in relations of actions becomes impossible. The question on the interrelation of experiences in varying space-time context replaces the Hobbesian question on the establishment of order. Consequently, what becomes the link that binds together the lost unity is the individual that understands, grasps, and interprets conditions, possesses power for acting, and whose understanding becomes the context where past and present take place. In the context of the new methods, articulationist logics, alternative models, methodological individualism, deconstruction, and understanding complement each other. Here we witness the creation of the theoretical equivalent of the post-structuralist flexibility of labor relations, and that of capital's new irresponsibility towards labor in the globalized society. Many contemporary epistemological trends have made significant attempts to deal with the question of indeterminism and uncertainty, but stop halfway. They do not pursue the inversion of this move, rather they show that the indetermination and instability result from the way social relations are constructed as unjust, exploitative, and subject to domination. That is to say, uncertainty is not a fundamental property of reality at all, but something produced by exploitative social relations which have to conceal. It appears as the failing of individual interpretation because of the fact that the individual interpretation is socially mediated from the outset. As a result of this, postmodern theory ends up just mirroring neoliberal capitalism, and we witness the creation of the theoretical equivalent of the flexibility of labor relations and that of capital's new irresponsibility. 6. In view of the crises of the social sciences, which accompanied the crises of societies up to the end of their 20th century, it is important to re-examine their epistemological subject matter. Against the structuralist and functionalist theoretical models working with the correspondence of structures and subsystems, we raise the question of the material element which instantiates whether these structures correspond to each other or not. This material element of social life is formed historically in relation to the way this life is threatened or preserved in theories shaped by social relations. In a sense, we shall have to talk about the values of life, freedom, autonomy, which, while being realized or cancelled, shape social relations in the terms of social life. These values emerge throughout the accomplishment of failure of the actor's aims in the context of historically crystallized conditions, that is, the historically specific accomplishments of other actors' aims and their instrumentalization. Of course, the conditions of social life's reproduction may coexist interwoven in an unclear way. For example, they may relate to institutions referring to labor power, property, ideology, and so on. Furthermore, the materialization of a certain kind of aims relates to one such condition may threaten the aims, values of other actors. The aim related to the private appropriation of the social means of life, for example, may threaten other actors' aims of using them for sustaining their own life. The conditions of socialized reproduction become hierarchically ordered in a world of competitive action where the attempt of some actors to establish their own ownership on them threatens the survival of others. The latter's need for obtaining these conditions emerges as a value. Nowadays, social sciences theory acknowledges that exploring the transformation of conditions into value is a move that belongs rightfully to its proper frame of action. The same applies to its further engagement with the main scandal of the Weberian epistemology that refers to the valuation of values as a political question. Conditions, aims, values, and the political evaluation of values constitute a given horizon. Beyond it, it does not seem possible to develop a frame of constituting social facts. Yet these relations still remain to a large extent unclear. As has been shown, the present approach stands against positivism in historical sciences, the scientific theory of knowledge, the hermeneutic approach, and the new epistemologies of indeterminism. Against the scientific theories of knowledge, Althusser, we pointed out that the discourse of science that seeks knowledge should not use the new against the old. It should not pretend to know nothing about now and want to learn right now something about now. It should not conceal the only knowledge established so far regarding the world, that is, its existing experience from the world, and the knowledge of value and materiality that constitute it and is constantly negated in it. I know what is presupposed for the constitution of a world where money and objects seem to rule social relations. I know that this world is one of antagonism, atomism, and non-solidarity. It is a non-collective and a non-cooperative world. The fact that the world is as it is allows the conditions of its reproduction to be constituted in the way they are constituted. That is, through dividing property rights, dependent labor, and then employment through the arrangement of the relation between humans and nature in a way that leads to devastation and is beyond the control of actors. One's knowledge of this fact is a result of humanity's previous experience, both scientific and practical. What one already knows is the experience presupposed for the creation of new knowledge. It is actually the difference from the knowledge of conditions. It is the experience of their unjust constitution. Without this experience, the knowledge of conditions in their structuralist and functionalist arrangements would be ideology, false consciousness. However, this experience and knowledge cannot be separated from the conditions of society's reproduction. It has to be mediated by them. The reason responsible for the existing constitution of conditions of socialized reproduction is the reason our experience takes the deficient form of a life of negative values. Thus, the development of a frame of presupposed knowledge for epistemology coincides with the actions that will mediate the terms of values by changing and destroying the atomistic and alienated form of the conditions of social reproduction. The attempt to develop a frame of presupposed knowledge allows the understanding of the historicity of knowledge and its epistemological subject matter. History constitutes a field where continuity and coherence have been restored through injustice. The sequence of its events developed with the actors being powerless and exposed to antagonism and exploitation. However, the fact that the thing could have developed otherwise is a value that in turn risks to appear to us as something absolutely metaphysical and totally coherent. If I abstract from the way the conditions of life are connected, this value does not emerge as an essence to be realized or a spontaneous order to be crystallized in the new worlds I shall found freely and independently. It rather appears in the form of acts of resistance towards the existing historical forms. I can then interpret and explain these forms with reference to resistance as the forming reason, the cause of the real's formation and its mode of negation. These points lead to the critique of the way the elements of indeterminacy have been introduced in theory by the new epistemology and proponents of various approaches like Luhmann and Giddens. These theorists adopt the division between determinism and indeterminacy, and against the dogmatism of determinism, they embrace the freedom of indeterminacy. However, indeterminacy may be identified with freedom only when it cancels the coherence of conditions defined through the relation of injustice, domination, and exploitation. As far as the critique is concerned, such relations remain always determined. They are always temporarily valid and under negation. The only binding elements prove to be those to the critique towards unjust, undignified, and humiliating conditions of life, and the action aiming to overthrow them. These ideas involve a certain conception of dignity, which is introduced in epistemology. Dignity opposes the definition to the extent the latter is identified with the insistence on the unjust constitution of the social condition that confines us. The task of social theory should be to investigate the conditions of life, value, and conflicts, and how they relate to the general reproduction of social relations. We shall have to talk about the values of life, freedom, autonomy, which, while being realized or cancelled, shape social relations. Values do not come from individual preferences at all, but a historically embodied reality. What are the implications of this? The need for obtaining the conditions for these values of life emerges from their being threatened. For example, workers need survival, and when survival is threatened, survival becomes a value. As well, environmental destruction is what gives rise to environmental values. Or in other words, the fact that the world is as it is allows the conditions of its reproduction to be constituted in the way they are constituted. Theory can only explain the world if it begins from the actually existing world. History constitutes a field where continuity and coherence have been restored through injustice. The only binding elements proven to be those of critique towards injustice, undignified and humiliating conditions of life. That is to say, order exists because domination exists, and this is the normative foundation. 7. In the course of reassessing the epistemological subject matter of the social sciences, we have to re-examine the range of a theory of dialectical materialism. The task of developing a reliable delineation for the concept of the theory of dialectical materialism is still pending today. The same applies to the range of its claims to be a framework of critical grounding for the social sciences. Most theorists, when referring to the dialectical method, usually mean the grasping of society as a totality and synthesis and unity of the antithesis within it. By materialism, they usually mean an objectivity existing outside consciousness. However, the significance of the Marxian program to connect these two lines of thought in the context of a theory of value has not yet been sufficiently appraised. The concept of the dialectic exposition of concepts included in the third Kantian critique of judgment, and the Hegelian logic of concepts contrast the concept of mechanism, necessity, with one of teleology conditioned by the idea of freedom. We may conceive society as a set of mechanical relations caused by the interaction of individual actors in the context of bourgeois society. According to Hegel, interaction is a category of necessary quasi-mechanical relation. Society is the machine that activates conditions so that they will reproduce its essential real structures, conditions, social objects, actions. However, this mechanism can be grasped as an abstraction insofar as it can only function as a means for the realization of aims that supersede it, that is, freedom, equality, solidarity. This program on the unity between mechanism and teleology is included in the dialectic of nature's intention, Kant, and the cunning of reason, Hegel. A transition from mechanism to teleology in the above idealistic theories binds the mechanical relations with a value, freedom, realized through the systems of competitive economy, liberal ideal. Even in its Marxist version, this dialectical exposition of categories contrasts the standpoint of mechanisms to that of teleology. This happens in a way, however, that it still remains unclear. There is a mechanical element in the concept of value we find in the critique of political economy. It refers to the amount of necessary labor that guarantees, during the process of exchange, the reproduction of society under relations of exploitation. This mechanical element of necessary labor is mediated and mobilized by money. It is capital that is a system of abstract labor establishing the forms through which reproduction takes place. In the Hegelian sense, the development of the forms of abstract labor may be represented as the teleology. The aim of individual capitalists are subjected to individual and unconscious aims referring to the valorization of capital in the context of a society as a whole. They are subjected to the aim of value as essence, substance, which becomes transformed into a social subject, mobilize its own self, and for which money and commodity are simple alternative forms. This teleology on the development of forms is part of a teleology of forms that moves in a way demonstrated by the Hegelian dialectic of the logic, the philosophy of right, and so on. However, in Marx's work, we also find a reconstructed teleology on the content of materiality, which contains the secret of the movement of formal teleology. The concept of materiality results through abstracting from the form of capitalist relations and from the aims of capital. Underneath the forms lies the content, behind the value in the magnitude of value exists human labor and human time dedicated to the reproduction of social life. However, what is this hidden content of value? Marx formulates this question as follows. Why does this content take this form? Why does labor expose itself to value? And why does the measure of labor, its time of duration, expose itself to the value magnitude of the labor product? This question reveals something about the nature of the material content even Marx himself did not attempt to clarify. The content should not be identified with the transhistorical labor forces that take their specific form in our time. The content is what is revealed as a content of the form value through the stage of the mythological exposition. It should not be identified with the opposite of form and value, in other words, the non-axiological that renders value as its form. The content has an axiological nature itself, and when devalued, it allows the constitution of the value form of political economy. Analysis on Marxism are mistaken when they present it as an ahistoric way as social labor in general. This content is rather constituted as the concept of social labor, for which it is demanded that it should not be affected by atomization, and also that its cooperative nature should not be cancelled, while its collective character should be established. The concept of social labor should be open to the emancipation from the fetishism of the form. In its context, it should not be possible to restore transparent, reasonable relations in the arrangement of the process of production should be open to being placed under consciousness in design and control as the product of freely socialized human beings. All these demands, values, are part of the concept of materiality. Indeed, without this axiological basis for the materialist theory, without the hidden teleology that was not clearly developed by Marx, the constitution of the contemporary historical real as a value, in the sense of the critique of political economy, would be meaningless. Our reading and interpretation of the reference on forms we find in Capital is directed and informed by this context. It is written on the face of forms that they belong to a formation in the context of which the process of production dominates man, and as yet he does not yet, dominate it. The teleological judgment of not yet is jointly formulated with the descriptive one that grasps labor as abstract social labor. It is a result of the contradiction within the contradiction of life, social and private. The cancellation of this contradiction constitutes a historical demand and presupposes a series of material conditions of existence. Okay, so the significance of the Marxian program is to connect both dialectics and materialism in the context of a theory of value which has not been sufficiently appraised. The form, value, money, and capital, and the content, human life, labor, and cooperation, are to be distinguished as the hidden content of capitalism, which is not merely labor as a technical activity, but human social cooperation. Now, why does labor expose itself to value, and why does the measure of labor expose itself to the value magnitude of the labor product? Behind the value and the magnitude of value exists human labor and human time dedicated to the reproduction of social life. And this concept of social labor should be open to the emancipation from the fetishism of the form. The goal is not simply understanding capitalism, but overcoming fetishized social relations. 8. Contemporary social theory must be constituted as a theory of value and direct itself towards the analysis of conditions, values, and norms and the transitions between them. The arguments developed so far point out that it is necessary to approach social relations in the context of a labor theory of value developed with reference to the relation of conditions, social values, and norms. This approach results from our critical analysis of the Marxian approach to the theory of value. It encompasses a synthetic exposition of the concepts referred to the conditions of social reproduction: labor, exchange value, money, capital, and it leads to a theory of capitalism. Our own approach argues that if the theory of capitalism is to get rid of its latent positive implications, it will have to reestablish the content of social relations by reviewing its value characteristics. In fact, formulating the economic theory of value in a non-positivistic way, in the context of the critique of political economy, presupposes a critical theory of human values. On the other hand, the search for a theory of the conditions of social reproduction refers to a more loose arrangement of conditions than those of the conditions of reproduction, conceptual and historical. We find in a political economic arrangement of concepts in the Marxian critique of political economy. A theory of the conditions contains an element of contingency, since it may refer to the economic, political, legal, cultural, etc. conditions of social life's reproduction. It's rational has similarities to Hegelian logics. It grasps the category of necessity as a relation of conditions, as a reality reproduced through them and through reproductive action. Furthermore, it associates necessity with the conceptual logic of teleology and freedom, value logic. In that sense, starting with the conditions may coincide with a start from the ideological. However, starting this way is necessary in order to reveal the multiplicity of conditions of social life's reproduction, and their arrangement. Clarifying the position of every condition in the totality of social relations coincides with the transition from conditions to values and the evaluation of each condition's significance for others in the context of this totality. The very critique of political economy constitutes a reliable explanation of the relation between the conditions of social life. It points out, critically, as a negation of the values of collectivity in the context of atomization, autonomy, communication, etc., in the context of contemporary world, the very reproduction of social life constitutes a value that may be affected by the anarchic dynamics of the capitalist process. At the same time, the social forms damaging social values, property damages collectively, are themselves conditions of social reproduction without property rights and labor can not meet the raw material needed for the production and reproduction of society. Certain subjective or latent conditions of the process of society's reproduction may be activated during this process or become conscious to actors when harmed by the existing social relations. The labor force, for example, is harmed by overexploitation, and the environment is damaged by capitalist relations of production, and thus the members of society realize the need for regulations protecting labor, the environment, and so on, and guaranteeing survival. The endangered conditions lead to the emergence of values that take the form of political action, resulting in regulations, norms. These regulations may constitute conditions of social life's reproduction for the next historical phase. These relations continuously impose on us the dual viewpoint of the cancelled, not functionally integrated, conditions of reproduction that affect social values or move to new ones, guaranteeing those harmed. A certain value may prove to be the preeminent conditions of survival. Democracy, for example, the free press, constitutes a condition for the prompt provision of information regarding the damages and risk of nuclear power stations. Democracy is necessary for the aversion of nuclear death. We have observed that the dialectic of conditions and values may be expressed and temporarily result in an institutionalization and regulation that takes the form of transition from value to rule. Capitalist property constitutes a formal term of social life, which nonetheless harms this life by leading to exploitation. The value of life is preserved through the norm, legislation on the working day, but this norm in its turn is threatened continuously by the aggressive forces of capitalism. One of the most fundamental questions of contemporary social sciences refers to the understanding of normativity as a functional and axiological term of social life. The classical idealist theory provides significant propositions on the relation between value and norm. Such questions are those raised by Kant in relation to the implementation of practical reason, morality, in the context of law, legality. The same applies to the question we find in Hegel's work regarding the law as a means and measure mediating the social. On one hand, in the context of Marxism, the question of locating the right norm of action in existing contradictory capitalist societies was not raised with clarity due to theory's haste in pursuing the opposite direction, that is, the negation of the existing relation of devaluation and the establishment of a new value consisting in new relations that transcend totally the existing ones. The theory of the 21st century can only be a theory that focuses on norms. This is already evident in the form of crisis of social theory. In the context of normative theories, such as those developed by Rawls and Habermas, the question of roles is constituted in an irrational way, since, under the pretext of the rational grounding, its connection with a reflection on the conditions of social reproduction and social value is broken. Contemporary social theory must therefore be constituted as a theory of value. Conditions produce values, which in turn produce norms, which in turn become the conditions for future social reproduction. 9. A theory of the conditions of social life proves to be unstable and contradictory. The above observations allow the establishment of what we've already claimed. A structural model embodying sequences of conditions in arbitrary arrangements is unstable and cannot be examined rationally. The social formations resulting allegedly from the correlations of conditions maintain the contradictory character of the elements composing them, and do not reveal, with the exemption of external analogies and parallels, the internal mode of these external elements. Articulation, for example in capitalism, are articulated the elements of money, property, power, technology, labor, and so on. Structuralist models repeat the commonsensical. When we refer to the conditions of social reproduction, we refer to the historically typical sets of economic, technical, political, organizational conditions, such as the administration and defense. Marx linked the conditions related to the contemporary mode of organization of social life in an arrangement that constituted the particular capitalist mode of production. Today, many theorists, for example Giddens, attempt to deconstruct this particular arrangement by breaking it down to separate dimensions such as industrialism, capitalism, nation, or military violence. However, both the proponents of structural associations and those of deconstruction have not yet clarified the nature of the mechanisms shaping social phenomena during their constitution and interaction. You know what? I was talking to a post-structural person, and I was like, okay, how do you explain why certain phenomena we see seem to take on a certain character that seems repeatable, you know? And they said, that they don't know. Okay. Anyways, these mechanisms are economic and political national and national. They guarantee the continuity and intensification of economic exploitation and the domination of classes by other classes, and not of societies, by other societies on a global scale. Our only way to understand them is the inquiry into the values they negate, but also the values they realize: reproduction, initiation, communication. Negated values are those that could preserve human life through the redistribution of economic resources and intentional action, and could guarantee health, the environment, participation, dignity. Only recourse to this normative nexus and modes of its negation renders the theoretical reconstruction of political, economic aggregates and of political institutions and forms of action meaningful. Without it, it becomes irrational. However, insisting on the conditions and examination of context of values raised and negated by the historical development of their correlation is a necessary process for the social sciences. These disciplines require a broad program of transitions between conditions, values, and norms. They cannot be confined to partly developed types of relations or types possessing essential characteristics only. For example, capital, economic exploitation, value of social labor. The reason for that is the development of such types beyond their essential characteristics allows the emergence of preconditions not included in their initial form. For example, the implications of environmental deterioration for political economy. Furthermore, it allows to escape the risk that the model will relapse to positivism. What arises here is the question of the dialectic exposition of value as a form of the content labor. The analysis of conditions allows the study of inversions of the classical political economic ordering of conditions, but also of the classical philosophical hierarchy of values. For example, a free political system, democracy, is not considered today along the Hobbesian model, that is, an impediment to survival, but as a condition for survival. Such inverted orderings oppose also many Marxist orderings which treat normativity, freedom, equality, exclusively as a condition of exploitation without considering the issue of normativity as a condition for human dignity. The analytical category condition, Bedingung, has a Hegelian origin. Our observations so far indicate that, albeit it is not appropriate for the construction of a social framework, of a structural framework of analysis, it is, nonetheless, necessary as the starting point for pointing out the historical the values, explaining the existence and correlation of the historical form of social life. In order to achieve the stability of a system of conditions, it is necessary to grasp the teleologies, the system of aims, these conditions presuppose. Understanding such teleological ontologies constitutes an impossible task according to the neoliberal theorists like Hayek. However, it is necessary and much awaited task, and indeed it constitutes the rational task for a modern theory of the social sciences par excellence. Finally, the interconnection of conditions compels us to approach the content of society as the product of abstract social labor, and simultaneously the result of private appropriation of the product of the collective social activity. Such an approach may help us to interpret the paradoxes linked with the issue of indeterminacy we find in social scientists such as Arrow, Downs, and Hirschman. In the context of modern societies, actors may attempt to secure a condition of social life collectively. For example, defense. However, according to the individual interest, they also move freely from a state of collective settlement of conditions for dealing with social problems to one where they separate themselves from the other actors and attempt to deal with these social problems individually. For example, by choosing between public and private health or school programs. Each time the nature of conditions in the public-private scale changes according to the opportunistic behavior of the actors. Yet this opportunism and its paradoxes refer us to the problem of materiality of contemporary historical societies and can be explained with reference to it. For explanation, see point 13, which I'm not nearly close to being at yet. Neither structuralism nor contemporary social theory explain how phenomena are actually connected. Structuralists merely list conditions, while newer theorists break capitalism into separate dimensions, such as industrialism, the nation-state, military power. I'd say Wallerstein as guilty of this, without explaining their unity. Society can only be understood through the values of the existing social relations, both realize and negate, and these mechanisms guarantee the continuity and intensification of economic exploitation and the domination of classes by other classes and that of societies by other societies on a global scale. Structuralists end up treating society as an assemblage of conditions, when Marx's achievement was showing how these conditions form a specific historic totality. He linked the conditions related to the contemporary mode of organization of social life in an arrangement that constituted the particular capitalist mode of production. Our only way to understand conditions is the inquiry into the values they negate, but also the values they realize. Many Marxist orderings treat normativity, like freedom and equality, exclusively as a condition of exploitation, without considering the issue of normativity as a condition for human dignity. And, I suppose that's true to an extent, but ultimately, I mean, it is both. It is both. It's not just one. If you think it's just one, you've fallen into humanism. 10. The social theory that will respond to the questions of the modern world will have to overcome the antinomies of the philosophical theory of values. As far as we can tell today, the social theory that arises will develop as a result of a huge collective effort aiming at the redefinition of human values, their hierarchical ordering, the understanding of the process through which they evolve to norms of implemented values, and their critique of the fetishized form in which they appear. The 20th century was the century of the rejection of values. It was the century during which they were rendered irrational. However, there were quite a few attempts to raise the question on values and acknowledge its scope for the grounding of the social sciences. Such attempts were made by dogmatic Marxism, but also by the positivistic camp of the Vienna Circle, and the irrational theorist of the material ethics of the values of the interwar period. The first approach was implemented in the political ethics of the Soviet state. The second comes mainly from Viktor Kraft, and the last one from Max Scheler. Most important in our context is Scheller's work. He sought to establish a theory of values in terms of a theory of the materiality. This theory was to argue that the values which arise from the analysis were to be a priori ones. They were to be independent of empirical aims and means. Furthermore, these values will result from emotional intuition and not any rational process. Scheller's model is a neo-romantic one, and from a political point of view, it is included in the models produced by the anti-democratic thought of the early 20th century. So far, I've argued for the need to ground a materialistic theory of values with reference to the conditions of social life endangered by society's current form. This demand is thought to invert and destroy Scheller's argument on values, and at the same time, to raise some methodological questions I consider important, such as the question of the hierarchical ordering of values. Scheller's hierarchical order includes 4 levels, moving from low to higher values. 1. Values of the pleasant and unpleasant, feelings and senses. 2. Values of the feelings of life, such as those of health versus exhaustion, illness, or old age. 3. Spiritual values, aesthetic ones, values of justice, values of known edge, the truth, though does not constitute a value, and 4. Religious values. Scheller's construction grounds values by moving from the higher towards the lower ones in the sense that when the higher value is in danger, the lower one will be sacrificed on its behalf. The whole hierarchical order is borrowed from the idealistic model of the theory of knowledge that refers to intellectual practical powers such as sense, representation, intellect, reason, will, ideas, theoretical and practical. The conception of a materialist theory of values we juxtapose to the Schellerian a priori relocates the issue of values sacrifice to the realm of historical reality. Social relations in modern capitalist societies are reproduced by affecting and destroying the relations of justice, the life and health of actors, and by canceling chances of education and dignity itself. In contrast to the Schellerian model, we consider values as preconditions for the realization of other values, not as a system of competitive levels. The relationship of freedom, justice, knowledge, and aesthetics, maturity of actors, even the things they consider sacred, constitute preconditions for their action. They constitute conditions of the arrangements they will attempt in order to protect their life, their health, and other fundamental values from the threats imposed by the very capitalist form of social relations, by war, environmental disaster, nuclear destruction, enslavement, and exploitation. Today, we cannot argue like Hobbes that the value of life is higher than freedom, democracy, etc., since we realize that democracy is a precondition for life. For example, by the contributing to avoid environmental catastrophe or nuclear accidents. The hierarchical ordering of conditions and values constitutes a political question that enters the reasoning of the social sciences. The point where politics coincides with values is their de-fetishization and the elevation of forms of life that need to be protected, enrich, and escape further destruction. Fetishization of values is also the one-sided appeal to them by the one power against the other, in the same way that demand for protection of rights is raised selectively. The 20th century was the century of the rejection of values. It was a century during which they were rendered irrational. Instead of values competing in a hierarchy, they function as a condition for one another. Like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, it has this literal hierarchy of like values and needs, and it's like, no, they're required for each other. We can not argue like Hobbes that the value of life is higher than freedom, democracy, etc., since we realize that democracy is a precondition for life. Freedom, knowledge, justice, and dignity are not luxuries to be sacrificed for survival, but the conditions that make survival possible. Now, I don't really agree with that. I believe that Marx is correct, actually, and not, Kosmas Psychopedis, and that man will only affirm himself through activating poiesis, which see my paper on my article on democracy I did a week ago, as the real point at which humanity becomes self-consciously self-forming, and so freedom appears primarily as a creative, productive self-activity. Psychopedis has creativity as, in what I just read, as one of a variety of values, which ironically puts him closer to Habermas, who he is criticizing. He actually seems to be very similar to Habermas, despite being critical of him. 11. The main task of social science is the critical examination and practical overcoming of the antinomies arising during the implementation of the axiological in the real. What is the real? Contemporary social scientists will ask. Hegel believed that it was constituted by internal substances and their epiphenomena, forces, and their manifestations, totalities, and their parts. Marx traced behind the realm metaphysic capital self-institutionalization, which today leads the process of privatization to global expansion. The real is the economies, policies, societies, and cultures. It is the globalized enterprises and mechanisms of money and credit, the technological systems and the continuously changing relations to the natural and social environment. Reality consists of the institutions and policies whose intervention or non-intervention allows these mechanisms to function. The nations and their incorporations, rallies and limitations, the belief systems, religions and ideologies, the military systems controlled by superpowers, especially by the one superpower, and so on. All these, however, should be linked in a way that precludes the external articulation advocated by structuralists and functionalists. This connection will have to turn to the element that constitutes historical social reality as such. The value is destroyed in order for the present forms of economy, politics, society, and culture to prevail. If our starting point was an ontology of values, the model of social science we put forward would be a Platonic one. We could define a set of unconditionally valid values, virtues, such as those of justice or wisdom, and then reflect on the antinomies of the implementation of the axiological dimension of reality, or in other words, on the mediation of values by reality. In the context of contemporary theory, however, determining what values are open to question in their nature cannot be identified with some a priori valid entities of a heavenly world. Values arise when the conditions of life are under threat or become problematic, and similarly, they're defined in relation to the conditions of life and their social forms. The conditions of life refer to the preservation of life and health themselves, to creativity, communication, friendship, and love. They refer to the power of people in giving meaning to their actions, using and interventing symbols, living in non-violent societies, contributing to the definition of collective goals. The particular tension through which these conditions subsist transforms them into the values for which actors struggle in societies of power, threat, and exploitation. The real then takes the form of cancellation of values. It becomes the negation of life and health by taking the form of conditions where food, water, and clean air are not available. The environment is destroyed and health becomes commercialized, human organs trade, and so on. It becomes non-freedom and non-health, namely wars and enslavement. It becomes the negation of love when women, young men, and children turn to prostitution. Instead of free, meaning-giving, it becomes a religion, fanaticism, philosophy. It becomes cancelled as communication and education, and takes alienated form with the reproduction of dogmatic knowledge or the misinformation of the educational systems and mass media. Vergenstandlichung becomes Entgegenstandlichung. I don't know German, so I don't know what that means. It is not possible to locate a state of moderation that would allow values to be implemented in the real, as Kant would argue. Kant appealed for a legality whose general form would correspond to morality. This loss of a state of moderation, the loss of the moderation in the mediation that permeates Hegelian logic, is typical of modernity. Marx, on the other hand, did not show any interest for a theory of moderation, that is, for the way theory's values, solidarity, cooperation, and freedom, can be implemented in the context of bourgeois society. Something like that would be identical to reformism. The only possibility to claim the real would imply that it has been overthrown radically. Socialism. That's a very good observation. Contemporary theory, however, has to raise again the question of the way values are implemented in the historical real, not through in its ideal form, which presupposes the latter's complete negation, and at the same time, avoid reformism. A substantial part of contemporary theory will have to be the theory of the antinomies of this implementation, a theory of the negation of moderation, and at the same time, its necessity. This theory will have to consider ways of avoiding relativism. This is essential to the extent that it rejects customary hierarchical categorizations of values and deals with the web of values, focusing on the question of indeterminacy regarding the ways and itineraries they link to each other. The outcome of these essentially historical and practical processes refers to the system of norms people will establish in order to regulate the social life with justice and dignity. The real consists of social arrangements that systematically negate human values. It appears as the destruction of health, war, environmental degradation, etc., and it becomes non-freedom and non-health. Marx believed that the only possibility to claim the real would imply that it has to be overthrown radically through socialism. Psychopedis proposes that contemporary theory has to raise again the question of the way values are implemented in the historical real. 12. The new social theory cannot abolish the concept of injustice and exploitation, however, it has to reconstruct them, thus contributing to the negation of the relations they indicate. If a condition, or a force constituting a connection of conditions, develops towards the direction of illuminating the values whose emergence it impedes, we can say the justice is done to this condition, the condition is vindicated. Otherwise, insisting on the positivity of this condition becomes unjustified in the relation with the object, for example, as expressed in the context of ownership. Here, the positivity of the condition is defended persistently against third parties without the appearance of responsibility for the deficiency caused to them. Thus, injustice emerges through the fetishism of conditions and irresponsibility prevailing in the way their exposition is lined up, irresponsibility within the real. The form of justice, which is rival to existing injustice, consists in the possibility for humanity to a. Abandon this persistent stand, starting with the recognition that this thing is not mine, and with the withdrawal of ownership claims towards social wealth and the products of collective labor, and b. The actions aiming at restoring responsibility in society in its relations with the natural environment. This action may include the redistribution of resources of the condition of life so that the values of life, health and autonomy and creativity can be safeguarded. Injustice occurs when this redistribution is not achieved and the conditions of life remain in their fetishized arrangement and atomistic connections, and as it was mentioned earlier, this form of connection in definition represents indignity. However, we shall have to refer to exploitation as well, even if the theorists, the new, and the critics of essentialism don't particularly like this. This term may be reconstructed on the basis of the values created and threatened by the social relations within which we live. For Marx, exploitation could be located at the level of mechanisms constructed by macro-aggregates, such as the constant capital, the variable capital, and the surplus value that embody social labor. He calculated the tendency of the rate of exploitation on the basis of the relation between those aggregates. If we consider, in Hegelian terms, this relation as necessity, we have to think of an activity that mobilizes the available conditions of reproduction and reproduces reality in the form of an object. However, this nature of the object is a normative one. It is freedom in the same way that the conditions of reproduction will and should be revealed as the free conditions of a free action. It may be argued that this transition towards freedom is the most difficult one. And the only way we can consider it today is by starting with the negation of freedom, exploitation. Exploitation is the lack of means for one's own subsistence, and thus life itself is constructed as a value insofar as the social form threatens it. The means of subsistence are owed by someone else, negation of autonomy, dependence, heteronomy, who exchanges them. By doing this, he has acquired a claim on the activity that reproduces social reality. Reality is constructed in an alienated form as non-autonomy and non-value. As a result of this process, it becomes impossible for agents to control the course and outcomes of their actions, negation of the value of control over them. The agents are not in a position to decide themselves what they shall offer to others without getting anything in exchange. This being perhaps the highest of values takes the form of the highest devaluation, that is surplus value, insofar as one would wish to decide or offer oneself to somebody or something The alienated form of surplus value expresses releasing one's own rights to be subjected to such legitimate exploitation. It leads to surrendering oneself and one's activity to be utilized by somebody who is alien to oneself to an owner of money and capital. However, in order for exploitation to exist, homogeneity of aggregates is presupposed. The condition, the activity, and object have to be recognized as coincide with value, and the concept of value. Labor is thought as homogeneous with fetishized and crystallized action, but also as freedom as its negation. Labor is thought of as a means of reproduction, a social relation, but also as the resistance to it, its obstruction. The negation of exploitation would then be the negation of homogeneity, without, though, implying the negation of one's ability and responsibility to recognize and compare values, and act consciously in the context of axiologically constituted worlds. So justice means reorganizing conditions so that human values can flourish, and it requires responsibility, redistribution, and the protection of autonomy. Exploitation is the lack of means for one's own subsistence. Someone else owns the means of life, creating dependence, heteronomy, and domination. The means of subsistence are owned by somebody else, and this, being perhaps the highest of values, takes the form of the highest devaluation, that is, surplus value. Voluntarily giving and cooperation then become transformed into alienated labor and extraction. Exploitation is not merely unequal exchange, but it's not that at all, actually. But it isn't actually that at all, but is a condition in which people lose control over their activity, lives, and ability to decide what they give to others. 13. The explanation of social action, too, will have to resort to a theory of the social conditions and social values. Contemporary debates on the method of the social sciences and the logic of explanation of historical and social actions constitute manifestations of the crisis of the social sciences, any attempt to ground them on the basis of scientism, structuralism, and hermeneutics. Nomological inductive forms of explanation are juxtaposed to forms of explanation based on understanding. Even in the context of Marxist explanatory systems, explanation consists in a move from the necessary structures, stable class relations, policies, etc., towards the element of it determines ideological, normative, teleological, etc. This form of explanation takes no account of the fact that A, the supposed stable structural relations themselves result from practices of exploitation, domination, injustice, and B, in order to construct its explanatory argument, any explanation of social action referring to the non-exploitive and just society are being negated. Values are introduced in explanation as claims for an action that will negate the devalued structures. Such structures are supposed to explain what happens or how the world is. However, what causes the world to be as it is that it shouldn't be. Scientism reaches its limits with the question of forms, that is the inability to explain the forms of social relations from the individualistic, selfish standpoint of the actors these relations incorporate. However, this weakness of scientific explanation is itself an expression of the fact that the forms of the real have been constructed in the context of a process that negates the social ability of actors and cancels their ability to create and give meaning to the conditions of their life. Social forms are explained as the outcome of the negation of social values that would allow them to be their opposite, that is, forms of solidarity in human coexistence. If this process of alienation of human social ability is repressed, social relations will not be in a position to be grasped rationally. They would appear in a double fetishized form. On the one hand, as the action of individuals pursuing selfish goals, and on the other hand, as given forms of social action. The explanation of social actions would then be confined to the Weberian program of reconstructing individual action in the context of which social forms are accepted as given, defying further explanation. In the case of the social sciences, we propose here a specific mode of explanation which reduces the expandium of the conditions of its reproduction into the values affected and confirmed through this reproduction. For example, the forms of action in the normative regulations on the protection of social labor can be explained as reactions to the endangerment of society itself, of social labor. from the overexploitation resulting from the antagonistic forms of capitalist economy. The functional conditions of society's reproduction are of course translated into political programs of people's demands. Both dimensions, the functional reference to the conditions and the practical reference to political values. In their interconnections and the transitions between them are necessary for explaining a regulation, norm, regarding, for example, the working day, protection from illness, etc. Similar questions on explanation are raised today in relation to the constant threats affecting the natural environment. Dealing with them requires the organization of social and communicative relations in a way that guarantees citizens access to information, transparency, and the constant critique of the administrative, economic, and technical actions. The explanation of a development in this field goes back to the critical examination of the relation between public and private in contemporary societies, the quality of democracy and the citizens' ability to deal with the functional and technical problems of their societies in a political manner. A certain idea of a reasonable relation between humans themselves and nature is included and anticipated in any such explanation. How should the welfare state be explained? On the one hand, of course, functionally as a condition of reproduction, securing through normative regulation the conditions of life, health, etc. under threat from the capitalist form of society, which leads to acceptable normativities by the actors. However, at the same time, it should be seen as a value for the actors directing the action that guarantees life and their participation in social decision-making. The explanation has to resort to the value of social solidarity in the way it is formed and negated in the context of capitalism. The explanation links these dimensions of knowledge, that is, of values, the functional and normative one, and incorporates in their interrelations the facts, questioning their existence reified form. In the context of this problematic, following individual orders of causal chains is of special interest. Every causal chain of acting develops to an already structured frame of action, which organizes the conditions of action that cancel out or promote social values. Thus, alterations occur in the core of the totality of conditions of values. In every chain of acting, relations that constitute values for some actors or vindicate the values of others are considered as a precondition. The organizations of particular chains of action may destroy the conditions of social life or resist and struggle to reinstate them in a political perspective. Obviously, the causal chain of the destruction of the conditions of life in a global context are activated directly, as a result of the communication achieved by the interests and markets. For example, the destruction of forests for purposes of exploitation in one part of the planet leads to environmental catastrophe and threat for human life globally. By contrast, the causal chains of resistance and defense from this chain of destruction are not constructed immediately. They require knowledge, information, mobilization, and coordination in a world that prevents or conceals information, while at the same time needs its universal expansion for its own reproduction. Thus, the explanation of the social fact or action cannot be complete if it does not refer to the problems of transcending the inertia and atomization arising during the attempt to create a social action that will form a just, non-destructive, and non-exploitative world. What causes the world to be as it is as it shouldn't be. That's a great way to put it. Labor protections are a reaction to the endangerment of society itself. Working hour laws, health protections, and welfare provisions emerge because social reproduction is threatened. The welfare state is simultaneously a functional necessity and a social value. Environmental politics require citizens to be able to access information, transparency, and constant critique. 14. The critical social theory reveals the axiological nature of reality by incorporating in it the dimension of indeterminacy. One of the central issues of the contemporary theory in crisis refers to the question of indeterminacy, see point 5. This incorporation, as it appears, for example, in the debates on postmodernity, takes place, however, in an external and contingent way, and most of the time leads to relativistic solutions. For example, indeterminacy is portrayed as freedom in relation to the supposed dogmatism of the project of the Enlightenment. The reason of the failure of incorporate indeterminacy in the context of the dominant theory society is connected with theory's inability to approach critically the question of values, the axiological question. However, critical investigation of the question of values reveals something apparently worth questioning. Values do not oppose the element of indeterminacy. On the contrary, they are constituted through it. The indeterminacy of the conditions reveals their inability to be constituted as such, insofar as they are not mediated by values such as justice and autonomy. It thus confirms that the continuity of the social is only restored through free, just, and emancipated social relations. In the tradition of critical philosophy, from Montague to Kant, the contingent is recruited in favor of critical reason. Every relation of exploitation and domination that cancels the realization of a society of free and equals is not necessary, but exists as a contingency. Undetermined are the relations of humiliate, alienate, and exploit human life. Thus, only determination can be located in the rational critical thought and free action that ends humiliation, thus negating indeterminacy. In Kant, we are faced with a double perspective on the problem of indeterminacy. On the one hand, Kant's transcendental method is thought to overcome the indeterminacy resulting from the juxtaposition of reasonable and rational instrumental action in favor of practical reason. On the other hand, Kant claims the negation of every determination and the indeterminacy of every relation that has become coherent and determined through domination and enforcement. In contrast to the postmodern juxtaposition, necessary contingent, the type of argumentation belonging to contemporary critical theory presents the two elements as aspects of an integrated critical argument. This argument undermines structuralism by raising the suspicion that it refers to coherent wholes whose coherence was restored through unquestioned practice of domination and exploitation. In the context of this argument, causal chains of action whose parts are connected in a linear way so that one's conditions of life, health, and dignity constitute means of someone else's profiteering are considered unstable. The anomaly in these causal connections creates an indeterminacy which will not be negated if the practices perpetuating exploitation and undignified relations are not negated. The theoretical perspective we offer permits the understanding of a hidden meaning in the intellectual processes that led during the 20th century to relativistic answers to the epistemological questions of the social sciences. In the form of conservative and relativistic theory, these approaches show the inherent antinomies of the very subject matter of the social sciences, modern societies. In models such as those of Hayek, the indeterminacy detected in relation to the construction of macroaggressions, for example, those of a Keynesian type, referred to the futility and ideological nature of the reformist ventures of Keynesian consensus. This venture was to control with rational interventionist policies a society constructed through atomization and through concealing information in the use of actors' conditions of life as a means for the enrichment of other actors. Thus, conservative arguments such as Hayek's conceives unintentionally the antinomy of a society of the type it wishes to preserve. Models such as those of Arrow and Downs or Hirschman depict the paradoxes and indeterminacies which are necessarily reproduced in society where the public realm may constitute the common realm of the actor's actions, that is, the elements that unite them, but also the means for the achievement of private aims for some actors who separate themselves from the rest and act competitively towards them. Such theories are ideological in the sense that they have not completed the critical thinking on their subject matter, which they treat as a positive reality. Even though, by depicting indeterminacy as a constituting element of modern society, they do contain unintentionally the critical dimension, they do not succeed in what Kant was asking from critique, to turn indeterminacy in favor of critical reason. Most contemporary theory treats indeterminacy as relativism, but in reality it is its opposite. It is what reveals where domination exists. Values do not oppose the element of indeterminacy, on the contrary, they are constituted through it. Indeterminacy appears because exploitative social relations are unstable, undetermined are in the very relations that humiliate, alienate, and exploit human life. Hayek observes social indeterminacy, but interprets it as proof against planning, ironically revealing contradictions within capitalism itself. Indeterminism, C, is not evidence that truth or justice are impossible, but evidence that exploitative social arrangements fail to stabilize themselves. 15. The issue of the coherence of the real appears as an issue of restoring communication and translatability between social practices. In order to understand the particularity of contemporary societies, it is important to establish the way communication is achieved among them and the way their differing symbolic systems become mutually translatable. This applies equally to the communication of parts within a totality and that of totalities in the interrelation. If we suppose that such communication practices are partly or wholly incompatible, we have to raise questions of the possibility of transition from relativism to bindingness, from the incompatible to compatible, in reference to such theory practices. However, we also have to deal with the risk of being led to a state of homogeneity, of abolishing differences, etc. That may result from restoring compatibility. The Enlightenment and dialectic theory of society elaborate solutions of negating incompatibility, which are of special interest to us. Rousseau thought, in the case of incompatibility of demands for political domination, it is possible to locate normative preconditions that can be binding for all actors. These preconditions, values, consist of freedom and equality. In the case they are posed historically, they are supposed to negate incompatibility. Kant's model is a more elaborate one. In its context, the relativistic argument is constructed as a dispute between contingent historical demands resulting from the imaginary intuitive part of the self on the one hand and the rationalist terms of the critique, freedom, equality, etc. on the other. This dispute results in indeterminacy being arbitrated in favor of reason. Thus, the rational argument constitutes a fighting party, but also a meta-theoretical and meta-practical reflection on the terms of a just and free action. This special movement of reflection constitutes the preeminent Kantian strategy against relativism. In the Marxian dialectic, exposition of concepts, the theoretical and practical demands of individuals and parties are reduced to the social totality, which reveals the special position they occupy. This totality is analyzed as form, property, money, capital, and content, collective sociability, social labor. The critique of the form of society claims that it negates indeterminacy and the incompatibility between different individual specifications of forms. Individual action, for example, is no more reduced to the aims of the actors, which are supposed not to be subjected to further analysis. It is rather conceived as the externalization and alteration of the active forces conditioning the whole. Of course, this theory was accused of being dogmatic, sensualist, etc. More recently, representatives of the new Frankfurt School, Habermas, accused it for being expressivist, substantializing the category of social labor. Restoring communication and translatability between heterogeneous practices and theoretical claims meets obstacles referring to the structure, hierarchies, and relations of domination pertaining to each practice. Yet it has also logical, linguistic, and rhetorical preconditions which incorporate the conceptual and linguistic schemes of human communication in their most abstract form. Such schemes secure the transition from A to B within a rational, linguistic, or rhetorical whole. However, they also raise obstacles for the transition from A to non-A. Such obstacles are not entirely rigid. They do allow weak transitions between schemas, even when they contain conflicting expressions. The starting point of our approach is the assumption that, first of all, the relation between heterogeneous practices does not expect to be restored through actual communication. It is always presupposed. Most often, it has been constructed by a previous act of domination. On the grounds of methodological considerations, we can envisage the process of communication and translation as already accomplished and as aiming at positing and clarifying the presupposed conditions of communication. There is not an initial point of communication without a presupposed material precondition. Any analysis of the transcendental conditions of translation will also have to refer correspondingly to a material a priori, the nature of which we have to exploit. what is of special interest for the issues at hand regarding the modern logic of the social sciences is the possibility of restoring the compatibility of incompatible practices, demands, etc., through the destabilization of those exploitative and dominating conditions responsible for the continuation of instability and incompatibility. Insofar as the systems of conditions of domination do not create stable relations exactly because they negate the possibility of a free and dignified life, their dissolution may allow stability and trust in social relations and establish mutual respect and solidarity, in order to restore the compatibility and comparability of two seemingly incompatible claims. What is needed is more than the reconstruction of the structural relation mediating them, revealing, for example, the position claimants occupy in the division of labor. A second move might also be necessary, that is, the critique of the way these structural relations are constructed. Both opposing parties share in common their participation in an unequal relation that has been established as dividing and dominating. The will to change, it unites them, regardless of their position as winners or losers. The fact that the defeated does not tolerate domination, and the winner does not tolerate the privilege he does not rightly possess, is something that refers to the dignity of both. Dignity is here introduced as a value in the analysis of the social relation, and makes the negation of the apparent incompatibility of positions possible. The construction of a coherent subject matter for a theory of the modern social world includes both moves mentioned above. A. The understanding of mechanisms, large financial corporations, military and political mechanisms dominating in a global scale through economic power, brutal violence, or the appeal to selective sets of rights. B. The resistance to these mechanisms emerging inside the mechanisms and in the environment they operate, a resistance that reveals the values affected or cancelled when these mechanisms are activated. The reconstruction of these two moves allows a form of communication within society and permits us to refer to its coherence in a non-dogmatic way. So Rousseau said that freedom and equality create common ground. Kant says that reason arbitrates among competing claims, and Marx says that conflicts are to be understood through social totality. As you can see, in all these cases, communication is never created from scratch, but rather is always already presupposed. Every act of communication already rests upon material social relations. The fact that the defeated does not tolerate domination, and the winner does not tolerate the privilege he does not rightly possess is something that refers to the dignity of both. This is an unusual attempt to ground solidarity in shared human dignity rather than class identity alone. Communication becomes possible not because interests are identical, but because domination harms the dignity of everyone involved. This is very Habermasian. 16. Contemporary social theory will have to raise again the question on the methodological exposition of the concepts that will allow the critique of existing social relations. 20th century epistemology mistrusts the attempts to seek a rigorous exposition of the concepts misconstructing the social scientific subject matter. The critique of the notion of a coherent social subject matter led social theory since Weber to doubt the idea of a coherent method. Thus, theory opposed the mode of systematic transition between theoretical terms that was typical of social theory up to the mid-19th century and is known as the exposition of these terms, concepts. This transition moved from a presupposition to depositing of the following term and provided a justification for the necessity of each of these moves. This justification referred to the historicity and value of terms, concepts. The Kantian deduction that moved from empirical facts to the transcendental conditions of their possibility constitutes such a transition in exposition. The same applies to the development of concepts in the Hegelian logic, which progressed from the categories of being to those of necessity and subsequently to those realizing freedom, idea or concept. The dialectical exposition of concepts constitutes the most significant form of exposition for social theory. The Hegelian form of exposition was received and developed further by Marx, in a way, however, that still remains largely unclear. Many theorists can refer to the transition from the abstract to the concrete as a characteristic mode of movement in the Marxian exposition of the concepts in Capital. I have pointed out elsewhere that the concepts of Marxist capital move from the theoretical concepts that constitute the preconditions for the development of the abstract essential relations, capital, to the development of the relation itself. After that, the analysis moves from the abstract essential relations to the concrete, grasps the unity of the essential abstract relations on the one hand, and the apparent forms of the surface of bourgeois society, necessary mediating it on the other. However, even now, it has not been clearly shown that, with the exception of the above, the course of the composition constitutes simultaneously, on the one hand, the positing of an axiological element, that is, of social cooperation in its achievement, division of labor, industry, science, technology, and on the other hand, a series of successive forms of its deteriorating distortion of this axiological element that makes social relations appear as the outcome of individualistic and egoistic action. All concepts undergo this process of distortion. The value of the reproduction of social life, for example, is distorted through its coverage by the variable capital. The value of providing the means of life, even to non-workers, takes the distorted form of surplus value, etc. The succession of the exposition of the concepts reflects on the interconnection of such values and their distortion. Marx seems to have been convinced that only a rigorous succession of concepts at a necessary and non-reversible exposition could guarantee the imprinting of the particular relation of materiality, values, and determinacy and historicity in his theoretical framework. Only a few theorists share this conviction today. Marcuse, in his book on ontology, tries to distort the coherence of the Hegelian form of exposition by starting with the concepts such as those of the existential experience, finite life, and historicity. Many theorists, instead of capital, turn to the Gudries precisely because the demand for a rigorous exposition and a coherent dialectical method is not raised there. Typical opponents of this exposition are from the left Negri and the right Arendt. Adorno criticizes the idea of synthesis, but makes clear the critique of idealist rationalism should simultaneously be a critique of the irrational, mythical. Idealism tries to give meaning to human social experience by incorporating it into the realm of the activity of the good, Platonic, Hegelian, or other. The critique of the idealist constitution is a critique of the lie that the good can be established in the contemporary societies without these societies being subject to change. It is also constitutes a critical appraisal of the social relations impeding this establishment. Finally, it reveals the lost difference the magical thought attempts to salvage in the form of the essence, the sacred, the absolute, the good, etc. However, the idea of the good in the form of being negated and cancelled must be obviously considered necessary for the methodical exposition of concepts. Adorno thought that the element of the destruction of the form should be incorporated to the methodical exposition of concepts before the development of form is complete. He proposed a form of exposition that would avoid the fact forms be justified by reference to a pre-established structure. Instead of a comprehensive exposition of the whole would be reconstructed through delivering a series of some equally significant totalities whose arrangement should be one of constellation, a concentric one. Thus, instead of the succession of before or after, Adorno's method would expose critical central issues, points, etc. through the combination of parts. Adorno's approach contains the risk that the analysis may lapse into relativist solutions. However, it points out the weakness of the classical theory of exposition. In order to arrange concepts in a sequence reflecting the relation between the precondition and its posting, this theory in turn presupposes the knowledge of the essential in its abstract forms. Such knowledge precedes the exposition and controls its individual steps. The relativism of Adorno's approach could thus be interpreted as a reaction to the dogmatism of such an anticipation of the essential we find in the classical theory of exposition. However, such a reaction would not take into account that classical theory, at least in its Marxian version, anticipates the abstract essential in the capitalist relation as a condition under negation, as a structure in crisis. Being under abolition and cancellation, this cancellation is justified by the unjust and exploitative nature of this relation. It has recourse to the values cancelled by this relation and becomes the content of the free and emancipated action. At this point, the methodical exposition of concepts will have to reflect on the nature of action. This presupposes that it will reflect on the transition from value to norm. Adorno refers to Kant's problem in the Critique of Pure Reason on the antinomies of reason. Kant, the theorist of the implementation of reason in experience, writes that abstracting from coercion, necessity, in order to consider freedom, runs the risk of abstracting from any norm as well. Consequently, what remains as freedom is something blind, that dazzles rather than illuminates. How can we preserve the rule without destroying the value and without this resulting to a new necessity? What sort of norms shall we set by our action in order to safeguard the values that are currently under threat by the globalization of capitalist forms and relations? How shall these norms avoid being reduced to dogmatic reglamentations, I've never seen that word before, being simultaneously in a position to promote the emancipatory aim while maintaining relations of mutual respect and dignity among the actors? This is the old, but always pertinent question, which is set forth by both citizen and social scientists of our times. So modern theory has abandoned systematic conceptual development and is to be subversive, it must recover dialectical exposition. This is why Marx matters, as he centers on dialectical exposition. The succession in the exposition of concepts reflects on the interconnection of such values and their distortion. The conceptual order mirrors the historical distortion of social values. The value of the reproduction of social life is distorted through its coverage by variable capital. The value of providing the means of life, even to non-workers, takes a distorted form of surplus value. How can we create norms that protect freedom, dignity, and solidarity without turning those norms into new forms of domination? That is the unresolved task of contemporary critical social theory.